thank you for joining us. Excited to talk to our panelists here about decarbonizing and the decarbonization opportunity in Africa. So why don't we jump right in? Josh, I'm going to start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you see as the decarbonization opportunity on the continent?
Yeah, great, thank you. And welcome everyone, thanks for coming out after lunch. Hopefully everybody got a cup of coffee as well. So you're sitting right now in an economy that is liberalizing its grid. The grids all around the world were liberalized over the last 30 to 50 years, starting in the global north, then coming to places like Turkey, Vietnam, and Indonesia. What's so fascinating about what's happening in Southern Africa is that liberalization is happening through clean energy. So what's happened in South Africa is we have a heavily industrialized economy. We have a grid that was breaking. Like other economies in Africa, the grid couldn't break. And here you have big banks, you have private capital, and then you had a middle-income consumer. So over the last 5 or 6 years, almost 8 gigawatts of solar have come into the grid, not because anybody woke up and cared more about the climate or more about decarbonization, but because the cheapest and most effective way to get good power was through clean electrons, whether that be wind or primarily solar. So decarbonizing of the economy at this moment still is all about creating a strong value proposition. It's still about creating unit economics that work. It just so happens in places like South Africa, that can happen through the only way to have that happen is through clean energy. So decarbonizing the economy, I think as we heard Justin just say, is still an economic value proposition. We just have opportunities here to do so with clean electrons from day one, or from this liberalization.
Dario, I'm going to swing it to you since Brighter Bridges has a more continent-wide view. South Africa offers an interesting perspective for decarbonization because they are starting with a dirtier grid than a lot of African countries. Usually the conversation then swings to why does Africa need to mitigate? We weren't part of the problem. This is not our circus, not our monkey. So what are you seeing in the rest of the continent in terms of the decarbonization opportunity?
I don't think I want to be part of the conversation around being the problem for something or not. I think I was just, before I came to stage, I was looking at some data around production of energy capacity per capita in Africa compared to India and Malaysia. I didn't want to go as far as the UK, right? And Africa per capita energy capacity is a fraction of semi-industrialized countries, okay? So I do think we need to distinguish between a conversation around like the blame game and the actual needs for the continent, okay? And when we look at the data, a lot of the countries in Africa are de facto powered by a lot of hydropower or geothermal and clean energy. But I think the flip side of the coin that no one talks about is the fact that there's no industrialization in most of the continent, which means if we actually were to compare the energy needs were Africa to industrialize at the level of India, we would probably be talking about a very different scenario over here. If you talk to us about the data that we have, I think most of the money, I think this opened up a Pandora's box of conversations, okay? Around categorizing clean tech, categorizing climate tech, categorizing my business models, and the associated financing. But most of the money in clean entrepreneurial space has gone to solar power. Solar power that is often not Africa only, but is usually emerging markets. And what we've seen is that usually entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, especially those supported by accelerators and ESOs, do not get involved in solar because of the high capex and starting capital needs. And they usually do anything from like waste management to briquettes to water solutions. And so I think these actually, we're talking about different scales of the problem. And so to bring it back to this, the blame game, are we even supposed to do this if we didn't do it? I think it's almost not relevant in the sense that the scale of the needs for Africa to get to a point, for African countries to get to a bare minimum industrialization point, that would put them in comparison with other emerging markets, not even with advanced economies. Emerging market, it's so vast that I think it makes this conversation a bit like unnecessary or missing the point. And then the final piece that I would like to mention that I think it's very important is that we look at these big numbers: Sunking, Zola, D-Light, B-Box, Lumos, right? Most of these companies have raised, Copa, who is no longer even a solar company, right? These are companies that have raised in the order of hundreds of millions, but likely for their financing model versus the renewable or like the climate tech component of their innovation, right? Because what they were doing was really like financing assets, financing, more than actually bringing to a table an innovation that would be solely climate focused. And I think this is very important because we start thinking that actually climate tech is getting much more money than it's actually getting, whereas it's likely embedded finance and financing solutions that have been getting money.
No, that's a great point. And I think you have opened up a few channels that I'll pick up on at various points in this conversation. But on that sort of like point about what are we actually seeing come to market, Utari, I might turn it over to you next. So E3 is an energy investor. What are you actually seeing coming to your stage of investment? And you can give the crowd context on what that is, that's actually investable and has the scale potential that you need as a VC investor.
Yeah, thanks. So just to take it back, when we had our first fund, it was primarily focused on some of the business models we just mentioned: solar home systems, productive use energy, and broadly what we call CNI. So if you're thinking 10 years back, and there was this whole conversation around opening up access to the energy space, electrifying households, talking about decentralized power solutions, I guess we were in that space. Then what we've then seen, which I guess are a lot of learnings from our first cycle of investments, is we've gotten to a point where, call it more broadly the power sector, if you look at some of those decentralized models that you've just mentioned, they fully pivoted into financing companies. And even to take it a step further, there is a big realization that some of these PEGO models do not actually work. So you now have a space where you have all these businesses which are now, call them purely financing companies. And then on the other side, you have a realization that for those innovative models they thought were working, they are now moving to a direction where you now have companies that are now seeking to solve the next frontier of innovations. So essentially, to Josh's point around how then do you have products that optimize the power or the grid, sort of have a solution which says, okay, listen, as a business, how do you solve for your power needs in terms of cost? As the household consumer, how do I have a bit more in my pocket? So we are seeing all these sort of business models now emerging. And maybe even to speak closer to South Africa, I think we are now seeing lots of virtual sort of innovative virtual power plant companies who are using this tech, and it's on the back of sort of the last 10 years and realizing that this is where directionally the market is going. Yeah.
Thank you. Felix, I'm going to pull you in to comment on one of the threads Dario opened up for us, which is the financing question. So Kenya CIC is an incubator, and any investors in the room will know the number one thing you hear from startups is we just need more money. So what does that landscape look like to you, who's supporting really early stage climate businesses? Where is VC money a good thing for you? Where is it insufficient? And what additional types of capital do we need?
Thank you. Well, the question of financing is always the big issue that is preventing, early stage companies to be able to commercialize, and that cuts across many African economies. Well, of course, at KCS, we have deployed a couple of financing instruments, which I will not, I would say they are not enough because the demand is quite high. But I think one of the key things that I'm trying to figure out nowadays is, we have looked so much how to are looking for money, to foreign investors looking at, Europe, looking at whatever. But then, I mean, for so many years, these resources have not been forthcoming. And the other day, somebody said that, in Kenya, for example, gave some statistics that really, made a little bit of sense. That we have more than 8 million, dollar millionaires in Kenya. We have $3.5 billion, that has been, put up, resourced by 300,000 chamas in Kenya, which actually is lying in the banks that has never been, utilized. This year, somebody said that we are spending 800 billion Kenya shillings, on real estate, but nobody is talking about financing the early stage ecosystem that is able to really spur manufacturing and create jobs, in Africa. And so for me, one of the key things I would really push forward, for all the African, countries is we need to start looking inward. What do we have that can be able to provide some kind of incentives to these kind of funds that are lying idle that people can be able to utilize to be able to spur, the early stage, financing ecosystem that we have. The more we continue waiting for foreign money, it may not, be forthcoming. And even if it is forthcoming, it may not come in the light, aligned to the needs of these early stage, enterprises. So I think for me is the high time that African economies start thinking, how can we be able to utilize the resources that we have to be able to do a few things, and that becomes attractive even to foreign investors, because you have seen, well, we have put a little bit of resources here that is quite aligned. I think, last year in Kenya, for example, at the early stage ecosystem raised up $800 million. So much of that financing is coming from foreign investors. But when you look at some of the companies that raise, such kind of funds, a number of them have gone down, so to speak, quite unfortunate, because so much of that financing was not aligned to the needs of those companies. And so for me, I think time has come for Africa to really start thinking, raise awareness and start thinking of how do we internally use the resources that we have to be able to attract the foreign investors to be able to come and also align themselves with what, the needs of the early stage, ecosystem that we are supporting. So I think for me, the issue is we appreciate, of course, what has gone out, but I think there's much more that we need to do in terms of cracking financing instruments that really align with the needs of the early stage climate tech companies that we are supporting.
Thank you. I think a clear theme that comes out in the climate conversation is it's very much a global problem with regional specificity. So Melvin, I'm going to pitch it over to you, maybe to defend global VCs, as Brega is one. One, where do you see the opportunity for global investors to play in this ecosystem? And two, how do you see the differences in the way the conversation plays out globally versus regionally?
Thank you very much. And I think you hit the nail on the head by framing the challenge as a global one. The challenge is solutions that are implemented locally. And so when you think about solving a global or broader spread problem, it's about how do you crowd in different stakeholders where it makes the most sense. So Felix made a good point and started by saying, how do we enable financing for commercialization? So for example, Brigger, we're a VC fund, pre-seed seed across Europe and Africa. And so whilst we have equity as our tool, the reality is we can fund innovation and take that early risk. And the good thing, I guess, with us is we can see what has worked elsewhere in the world and say, like, look, what does that enable us to understand in Africa, but more importantly, with partners on the ground, understand the African situation? But that being said, I mean, Utari spoke about big C&I projects. The reality is my $1 million equity check won't get you anywhere if you're doing a big C&I project. And so it's very important to understand matching the right capital, the right issue. I think often when you speak about climate, you'll think about the big number. So you hear about climate financing in Africa, and it's a big number, most of which may be debt versus equity. So the question then is, who's plugging the right gap in the right place? In South Africa, I mean, there's an 8.5 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership that was launched. Again, lots of international capital coming to Africa, but realizes that the problem is not a South African one, but South Africa has a role to play in addressing the particular issue. And so as a global investor, the question for us is always like, where can our capital add the most value? And that's the tough conversation often to have with entrepreneurs.
I was going to invite other folks to comment. I know this is a topic that inspires passions, so go ahead, Dario.
You know, I think I used the word Pandora's box, but it's a Russian doll that we keep like opening. I think on these 2 points, we just did a study on Latin America clean tech and then one on Africa clean tech, climate tech. And it's interesting because specifically our client was interested in the entrepreneurial space. But this has become extremely polarized because you have the B-Box, and then you have the WASH initiative that is an in-between of humanitarian development, grant funding, and social enterprise. Nothing to do with the scalability of a startup. And then you have the B-Box, and then you have the big one. They are raising hundreds of millions. They're raising hundreds of millions for financing models, right? And the gap that is there between the grassroots or like entrepreneurial initiatives and the big ones are gigantic. And then what he was saying, most of these initiatives are funded through debt, which brings me to another issue, which is, I think one of the questions that you put in the document was, when is VC relevant? When is VC appropriate, right? And I was looking at the composition of capital of the top 10, 20 companies that have been raising funding in solar, because they are the one that really move the bar when it comes to like calculating the funding. And most of this money is corporate, so EDF, Mitsubishi, Shell, and the other part is either big impact investors, DFIs, private equity. There's some component of VCs, but we can open another Russian doll, which is VCs whose LP base is DFIs. So when you actually break it down, you realize the complexity of this. And I think the question that you pose, which when is VC appropriate, and by asking when is VC appropriate, you mean when are the mathematics behind VC financing appropriate for this? That becomes very tricky. And I think there's a big soup of complex financing, sometimes misallocated financing over the past few years, that really confuses the scenario right now. Because you're like, what in the world are we're doing? When have we got any right? And then at the Young Conference the other day, I think someone brought up the fact that the ecosystem is extremely young. So many funds are even yet to be able to present the data of their performances. And we'll probably only know this in the next 5 to 7 years. So how are we going to be able to find now an answer to this question?
Yeah, I was just going to add a point, and I think maybe hopefully to tie some of these points together. So Ashley was the CFO, funded by EAV, the predecessor of E3, working in solar. And I think one of the major takeaways from that experience and why we actually founded Holocene, so Holocene's a pre-seed climate tech investor here focused primarily on Southern Africa, but across Africa as well. And a big reason for founding that was to help the next wave of startups do this better. Because the big takeaway from that first experience of off-grid solar and climate tech in Africa, and I hope entrepreneurs are listening, because I do think at these conferences we talk way too much about VC funding and way too much about funding, period. Everyone needs to go sell a product. So before you ever approach a venture capitalist for debt or equity or anything, go sell a product. Sell something, whether it's consulting or whatever else it may be, to someone. Because what that means is A, you're solving a problem, B, you're getting some of the most important data in your business, which how big is this problem? What is the value that's created by solving that problem? That's your pricing. So if you sell something for X and it costs you Y to produce it, you're starting to see how big is the problem and how much margin is left over. It's really important to, and the last part is you're actually getting out of the building talking to customers. Too many people love to sit in a room. I mean, there's a saying that an engineer is someone who makes up problems they love to solve, right? So like, go solve a customer problem. I say this all because the only way to figure out if you can take on debt or if you need VC capital is that sales data. So in order to repay debt, you have to have positive cash flow coming into your business. In order to look a VC in the eye and say, hey, would you put money into my business? When you say that, you're implicitly saying, I believe I can turn $1 into 5 or 10 within 5 years. You need to believe the numbers. You need to have that data in order to bring in any of this capital. The last point I'll make is, I mean, VC in Africa was what, about 4 billion last year? Does anybody know how big Andreessen Horowitz is? So one of the preeminent firms in Silicon Valley, they're $40 billion. That's one firm. That's 10x the entire 54 countries of Africa. There's not enough capital, period. So don't ask for that capital until you think you have something, until you know you're onto something, and until, if you do have debt in your capital structure, you could pay back that debt. So I think the conversation we need to start with the entrepreneurs solving a problem, proving out unit economics, and then we can talk about VC and debt and everything else.
But to me,
I think that's a really great segue, and I'll sort of pass this around the panel so you can either answer my question or find a way to shoehorn whatever you want to say into the answer. But I think Josh hits on a really good point, which is like, what's the actual problem you're trying to solve? And I think when we talk about climate, we often assume that the deep innovation is going to come from the global north, and then Africa will be the scene of adaptation or just tweaking a product that exists somewhere else. So two related questions. One, where are areas you see gaps in the solutions coming to market in the space of decarbonization? And two, where do you think Africa has the right to win? So I'll start with Josh, and we can just go around.
Oh man, you caught me off guard. I mean, again, I'll come back to this. We look a lot at the Southern African grid, like we think it's fascinating. And when you map the value chain in that market, there's huge gaps in that value chain. Gaps that in any really developed ecosystem would not exist for more than a couple minutes. There'd be capital raised, people would start building here and here. In Africa, what we do have is gaps in a value chain. So whether this is around, and I think these are some of your investments as well, around wheeling. So how do you make a private-to-private power transaction along a municipal rail? Movement of electrons, grid optimization, things like that. We're seeing big gaps in the market, which for entrepreneurs is awesome because you can go build. If you get it right, no one's probably going to outperform you. So there are big gaps in these value chains. I think we just have to dig deeper and find, again, as an entrepreneur, find that part of the value chain that is the most capital efficient and that has the most value. The most value is created at that piece. And we could go through multiple sectors and talk about where the gaps are. And then ideally, I think groups like everyone up here can help people build smartly into those gaps. We're all investors, but I think everyone here has been an entrepreneur or has that entrepreneurial mentality. We will help. That is the good part about African VCs, is we want to see people be successful.
Well, in addition, I think I'll look at it. Also, government should, plays a very critical role in closing that gap because, of course, they have to really provide a very critical, enabling environment. That's number one. Number two, of course, we need people who should be able to catalyze that ecosystem to be able to provide those kind of solutions. And that talks about incubators, accelerators. And of course, we'll go back to the issue of the problem of financing because they need, money to be able to, close those gaps and ensure that these companies have become investor ready and the PE funds can be able to look at them. So I look at it from a government perspective, but also sourcing the catalytic guys who are really providing support to the entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so I agree with you both totally. Just from our experience, and I reflect back having spent a lot of time in the African ecosystem just to try and understand, especially for the startups that have failed, where exactly were the gaps? And the one thing, or the common theme that I seem to realize is a lot of these companies that raised a lot of funding really didn't have a localized solution that was actually solving a need, an actual need. So the one gap, which I guess it's more of a call to founders in the room, is to understand whatever you're building for, is it actually solving an African problem? Because what I keep seeing is you have all these startups, they're raising rounds of funding, and at some point, let me use Kenya for instance, you walk into the villages, you realize, actually, this problem doesn't exist. So the key gap is we need to ask ourselves, are we actually solving for an African need where a problem does exist, so that over time, we are not telling investors in these other markets that we are raising all these rounds of funding for non-existent problems. Yeah.
I think building on that and asking the question about context in Africa, I think something that I'm very fascinated by is how do you decarbonize the supply chain? And so we know that 90% of global emissions typically comes from the freight and logistics, often by tracking. And the reality is in Africa, we don't have the infrastructure capacity to build the railways. Cape to Cairo has been a dream since Cecil John Rhodes came to Cape Town over 200 years ago. It hasn't happened yet. And so the question is, given the current context, what does success look like? And so just applying your mind in a smart way about thinking, how can you use, yes, it may be trucking, but how do you optimize your trucking? How do you help companies think about them differently? And there's so many ways across the value chain, which I think can be done. And I think to your point about thinking the African context, in Europe it's fairly easy, but in Africa it's a bit nuanced. And it's not saying, yes, you won't go to electric tomorrow, but it's about being smart about what's in front of you and thinking about those solutions.
I think maybe to close the loop as to how I started, what Josh was saying, comparing to Horowitz, like African economies have so much to build. Like energy is a tool to an end. You don't need energy per se. You need energy to do things, and the gap is so vast that I think playing the blame game as to whether you should do something because other people are telling you to, when your power production is a tiny fraction compared to everyone else, and this means that your economies are crippled, I think that's a wrong lens to look at the problem. I would ignore that problem, and I'd be like, yeah, we still have so much to build anyway, that we can 500x the amount of energy that we need, that we have, and we'll still like have a lot to build, right? And then maybe on a more practical side, I think the conversation on VC now is become, I always say in every panel that there's a non-numerical metric that I found to be very positive in the ecosystem, which is the level of maturity of the conversations. And 5-10 years ago, the conversations were not that critical around the composition and nature of capital. They've now started to become probably the main conversation around the space. And this is the byproduct of having more investors, more successes and failures, and more types of instruments that are on the ground, and methods, right? And if you look at, as I said earlier, at the most funded organizations that are actually raising 100x compared to the small entrepreneurial space, these are not funded by VC necessarily. They're funded by corporate partners, by project finance, which is a huge part of the thing that no one talks about. Like companies, when they get to like Series B, Series C, especially in the climate tech space, they start getting project finance because they are allowed to do like moonshots and specific projects in the order of millions of dollars, because they have the assets, the reach, the customers. And so understanding the breadth of the financing landscape beyond the VC narrative, especially in this space, it's critical. And how do we do so? By actually keeping an eye on the specific partners that you could have, right? A few years ago, Toyota came to us and said, we're setting up a vehicle for clean tech and logistics in Africa. As Toyota, there are at least another 100 companies of that size, maybe not the size, but roughly, in the world, that have operations in Africa that would love to be in touch and might not have contact with the ground because they don't know who people are. And I think it should come from the demand side. Keeping an eye out, looking at who is actually doing broader work. They might not work with startups. What we've seen is that many funders that come to us to do data work for them, they ask us, do you only focus on startups? But here we're not talking startups. We're talking solutions, right? And so by changing the narrative, I think we can unlock so much more partnership potential and so much capital potential.
Thank you. Looks like we actually have a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to throw out a question, and the first two to answer get the last word. Is there a trend or development you're watching in decarbonization that makes you excited about where the space is moving in Africa? Yeah, the question was, is there a trend or development you're watching as it pertains to decarbonization that makes you excited about where this conversation is going in the African context? Melvin looked like he had...
So it goes to the point that Atari mentioned. So as a VC, we probably see 1,500 companies in a given year. And I think for me, the trend is more so entrepreneurs focusing on solving tangible problems. I think in the climate tech space, many entrepreneurs, a lot of their business cases required cheap DFI funding versus core fundamental value add. And so what's exciting me when I look at entrepreneurs today is there's a more focus on value. So for example, there's a question around carbon credits. And if you build your model based on the price of a carbon credit in a market that isn't like regulated or vetted, your business model is not so strong. And so entrepreneurs are actually asking core questions and saying, hey, what can we do to either create the validity in African carbon credits, or for example, think about a carbon credit exchange or vetting. And so actually by understanding the problems in their models, I'm excited by the depth that entrepreneurs are going around solving very niche situations. Whereas I think a few years ago, it was very broad and saying climate and going into asking what's the core problem we're solving and how do I solve the problem that I'm facing as an entrepreneur?
maybe to build on Dario's point as well, I mean, at this point, 10 or 12 years into the climate sector really beginning and starting to get some sort of development, it's good to see capital starting to specialize. So I know there are grant funders in the crowd today. I believe there's revenue-based financing in the crowd today. I believe there's pre-seed investors, there's seed, there's Series A, there's corporate. So 10 years ago, that didn't exist. It was just like maybe a little bit of equity, good luck. So the market is specializing, the investors are specializing, and again, from an entrepreneurial perspective, really utilize that potential grant capital to de-risk your commercial model. Start to think early if you need to bring in any sort of non-dilutive capital to cover assets, and then really utilize your equity, generally paired with human capital, to progress. And I will echo Justin's point. If he's still in the room, it was an awesome point. Stay in the market. So it's all product market fit versus runway. Can you stay alive long enough to realize product market fit? It generally takes a really long time. MCOPA has been going for 18 years. They found product market fit finally. Like, it might take 10 to 18 years to figure this thing out. Can you survive long enough? And with climate, so much of this stuff it's a moment. It could be command and control regulatory, it could be carbon credits, it could be something that all of a sudden tips the scale. And are you the team, are you the business model that survived long enough to be at that tipping point? So utilize all this blended capital and the specialization of the sector to stay in the market.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and thanks to our audience for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.